Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. Thank you so much for joining us for SMA Clinical Trials, What You Need to Know. We're thrilled to have you here today. We'll give you some details on how you can receive the recording of this webinar at the end of the webinar. And for now, we'll get started with Kenneth Hobby, President of Cure SMA.
Great, thank you. And we're going to dive right in. So if we want to go to the next slide. One thing I'll say as well, just as Amy was saying, we are recording this webinar. We'll send out an email, I think, next week with links to the recording. But in addition as well, we'll actually make sure that you get the slides here. So don't worry about noting anything down, taking screenshots or pictures. There's some slides later on that have an awful lot of detail in them on all the clinical trials that are currently active, criteria to get into those clinical trials. But we'll send that out later. So don't worry about keeping track of all the details here. One thing I do want to say as we start off talking about clinical trials is to say a thank you to everybody that's involved and participating in the clinical trials that we have going on. It's a lot of work to participate both for individuals and clinicians. And so we wanted to kind of start off by saying a thank you and that reminder that these clinical trials, they're very important for the future of the whole community. And participating in a clinical trial is not actually about getting access to an approved treatment. It's participating in a study, in an experiment that is going to help, hopefully, the whole community in the future. So it's a thank you for everybody that's participating. It's a lot of work. There's no guarantees. And often we're using those kind of narrow criteria, even placebo controls that people are participating in to help us, the whole community, ultimately. What we have going on right now is a very busy stage of clinical trials in SMA. It's very busy and it's actually very exciting with what's happened recently with some of the clinical trials, some of the programs moving into the final pivotal clinical trial stages. What I wanted to highlight here, though, is a little bit of kind of history going back away with what we've been focused on initially with research and clinical trials and getting approved treatments focused on the genetics of SMA. That was the first thing that we've been focused on, getting treatments all the way through those stages to focus on the genetic cause of SMA. That's the first stage that we've worked through. Where we're moving into now in this exciting stage that I think is coming next for us is building on top of those genetic treatments and especially focused on the symptoms, the muscles that are impacted in SMA and going through clinical trials, hopefully reaching a stage soon where we could have approved treatments that work in combination with the genetics, on top of the genetics, to help bring back lost function. That's the stage that we're close to now, that we've done a lot of research for, that hopefully we're going to reach over the next couple of years. What we are working on with some early research now is what's going to come after that. So genetics first, then the muscles and the symptoms. What's going to come afterwards is a focus on the nerves themselves, the connection between the nerves and the muscles. What is it that we can do with additional treatments there? And a lot of this is building on top and combinations that we've talked about for a while, not looking at just one treatment here. It's going to be a combination of treatments and even care as well. There's going to be our ultimate answer. What I wanted to do is at a high level, just to introduce what's going to come next, is the reminder on how we've gone about clinical trials in SMA in the past, that we've been successful. We've gone about SMA clinical trials in the right way. It's something that really stands out, very special for the SMA community, how we've gone about trials that's given us the results that we've seen so far. It's a little bit of a reminder here that what clinical trials are actually about, and the focus that we try to maintain is getting the best data that we possibly can to give to the FDA. That's what clinical trials are about. Again, it's not about getting access to a treatment now. It's about getting that best data, the powerful data that we can give to the FDA. That is what's been done in the past. And what we've seen in the past is when we give powerful, strong data to the FDA, results in not just approvals, but also broad labels. That's the first step. That's what we've kept a focus on through clinical trials in the past and what we've been doing right now. The idea is we get those good labels, we get the approvals from the FDA. That is then what transfers into the access for approved treatments, what we need to do after the FDA approval to work with payers and get coverage. But it's that focus on doing these clinical trials in the right way, having those very narrow criteria, which we know is tough often, that people get a no, they can't participate in trials. But those narrow criteria, placebo, sham controls, That's what gives us that powerful data that ultimately results in the best access for the whole community further down the line. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what we do have going on right now. And there's a number of buckets that we see going on with current clinical trials, but also this exciting stage where we've seen a number of programs now reach the final pivotal clinical trial, but also reach this milestone of full enrollment, getting all the patients into those trials that are needed, that now allow us to hopefully complete that trial as quickly as possible now. Again, focused though on getting that best data out at the end. So one of the buckets that we have going on right now, number of trials, and also some of the trials that have reached full enrollment, are approaches to try and optimize the current genetic treatments that we have. Can we get a little bit more out of the treatments that we've got, a little bit more benefit from them? And that's very much worthwhile doing when you have an approved treatment, in looking, can you get some more out of it? So there's a number of approaches going on there with trials that look at different doses, the current treatments that are approved, different ways of delivering them. And the idea there with the genetic treatments is, can we get more from those genetic treatments, delivering more of that SMN protein, maybe in different places at different times, maybe just at a higher level, that could give us additional benefit. And so that's something that's very exciting going on, and a number of programs, trials there that have reached full enrollment. The next stage is this building on top of the current treatments, working in combination, especially focused on the muscles first. Can you add on treatments that will go beyond maybe just slowing or stopping the progression of the disease from the genetics, to bringing back lost function, bringing back symptoms, correcting symptoms that might be in place there? And so it is very busy. It's a very busy clinical trial time. You'll see, I think, close to 8 clinical trials that are still going on, new trials, and actually are recruiting right now. And then again, these 4 program areas that have reached this very exciting milestone, full enrollment now. And what we'll also describe here is what is going to happen next with those programs, those trials. What happens as we work through final timelines for those trials fully enrolled, aiming then to go to the FDA for those approvals that we hope will come next. One final reminder from me here, and then I'm going to ask Jackie to come on, is a little bit of background of what we've seen so far in the SMA community. We've seen success, a lot of success so far, and that has come from the way that this community has done clinical trials. But it is a bit of a reminder that that is actually very unusual, the success that we've seen. Trials giving positive answers, getting the approvals from the FDA, and getting those broad labels from the FDA. That doesn't happen very often. Usually trials fail. Usually, you don't get the approvals from the FDA and the broad labels. So what we've seen in SMA has been unusual. We certainly hope that it continues, but it's a little bit of kind of a high-level summary here that that's not the norm. And also things are going to be a little bit different as we move into this next wave from what they were when we had our first approvals. And so what we're dealing with now are treatments that are not just about the genetic cause, that is the same for everybody with SMA. When we start to look at the symptoms and the muscles, that can be a little bit different. Different stages of SMA may have kind of different aspects going on. And so we don't know if the FDA is going to look at these next stage treatments in the same way as the genetics. I think more important than that, though, is now we're building on top of approved treatments. And the bar gets set a little bit higher from the FDA. When you've already got something approved, the FDA looks for improvements on top of that. So it's no longer just a comparison with natural history untreated. Now we're comparing on, is there a benefit on top of what we've already got? So the FDA raises the bar a little bit. And I think as well, when we're looking for those measurements, when we're measuring what the changes might be from these combinations, it is on top of benefit that's already there. And so those changes become a little bit smaller, a little bit more difficult to measure. And so that's a little bit different this time around with the combination treatments that we've got going on. But again, we're very hopeful. We're certainly doing these trials in the right way, the way that we did them before as well. And so with that, I'm going to ask Jackie to come on, who's going to lead into a lot more detail on what we'll go over today, clinical trials, how they're running, and then we'll actually get to these specifics of the trials that are currently going on and just finished enrollment. Thank you, Jackie.
Thanks, Kenneth. So I wanted to give an overview before we dive in here of what we're going to cover today. So the first topic is kind of where we are. So we'll do a quick review of the FDA approved drugs for SMA and a little bit about how they work. The second topic is where we want to go. So some optimization of current drugs that you just heard Kenneth mention, things like dosing and delivery, and also new drugs to meet unmet needs, and how these drugs can then be used in combination with each other to achieve greater therapeutic effect. And the third topic is how we get there. So that will be an overview of the clinical trial process to test investigational drugs, the regulatory approval process, so what happens after a new drug application is filed with FDA, and then we'll move on to some of the exciting drugs currently in clinical trials. Next slide. But I want to take a step back before we begin and talk about the current landscape in SMA. And so I think, as all of you know, there are 3 FDA-approved therapies for SMA that have really revolutionized and dramatically changed the natural history of SMA. We know that early identification and treatment dramatically alter long-term outcomes, and this is most striking when we look at pre-symptomatically treated infants. But we also know that treatment of symptomatic individuals can provide improvements, including increasing function or stabilizing or slowing loss of function. And we also know that there's still significant unmet need, especially for those individuals who weren't able to be treated prior to symptom onset. And lastly, about 30% of all individuals with SMA remain untreated for various reasons. Next slide. And so if we look at our Cure SMA drug pipeline, you'll see those 3 approved drugs at the top. They're listed by chronologically. So Spinraza was approved first, followed by Zolgensma, and then Evrysdi. And I want to talk a little bit about those drugs to set the context for some of these drugs that are in clinical trials. Next slide. If we back up and talk about the genetics of SMA to give us a little bit better context for these drugs, you can see here in this schematic that we have SMN1 and SMN2. And so the key difference, everyone except individuals with SMA have SMN1 and SMN2, and the key difference between these 2 genes is this change from C to T, which causes this, what I like to think of as a puzzle piece. It's called an exon. It causes exon 7, or a piece of the puzzle that makes the mRNA that then makes protein to be missing. So you can see that depicted here in different colors. So SMN1 produces the full puzzle, the complete mRNA sequence that results in fully functional SMN protein. SMN2 has that nucleotide change, that C to T, that causes a piece of the puzzle to be missing in about 70 to 90% of the transcripts that are made. And so that's represented by pink here, which is not a bad protein. It doesn't do harm, but it's not as functional as the green or the fully functional SMN protein here. So Sarah, if you'll go to the next slide. So in the case of SMA, individuals are missing their SMN1 gene, both copies, and they have to rely on this SMN2 gene. And so they don't have as much fully functional SMN protein. And so if we go to the next slide, the 3 approved drugs are focused on increasing levels of SMN protein for people who have SMA. And the first one, or gene therapy that we're going to talk about, is simply using a viral vector to replace that missing SMN1 gene, and this is Zolgensma. The other 2 drugs, Spinraza and Evrysdi, focus on redirecting this splicing, so getting more of that exon 7 or that missing puzzle piece included to make more fully functional SMN protein. And so these drugs are all focused on increasing levels of SMN, targeting that underlying genetic cause of SMA. Next slide. And so when we think about novel therapeutic strategy, we start to think about SMN independent approaches. So these are things that don't focus on increasing SMN levels in the body, but focus on other ways of restoring or enhancing function. And so those are things like neuroprotection. How can we protect the neuron from injury or degradation that results as in people with low levels of SMN protein? Neural transmission, how can we get that nerve to better talk to the muscle? Regeneration, how can we promote axonal growth, the part of the neuron that extends to the muscle? How can we promote its growth? And how can we promote muscle regeneration? We're also looking for other things like other genetic modifiers beyond SMN that might impact disease. And then combinations of each of these or all of the above with our SMN enhancing approaches as well. So thinking about these SMN independent approaches as being able to be combined with our SMN dependent approaches. Next slide. And so that's just summarized here in this chart here. And we know that it will likely take a combination of these therapeutic approaches to achieve the greatest therapeutic effect. And so when we talk about combination therapy here, what we're really talking about in this context is just 2 or more therapeutic agents that work together through the same or different mechanisms of action that can be used concurrently. So we're thinking about a drug maybe that upregulates SMN, like one of the 3 approved drugs, and then something else that might function to enhance muscle or some other non-SMN directed approach. Next slide. And when we take a further step back, we think about this really holistically, with the foundation being care, nutrition, things like PT, respiratory care, that kind of thing. And then in the context of the different therapies, some that can be used in combination to really provide the best outcomes possible. Next slide. And so I'm currently excited to share that we have 6 drugs in clinical trials, and you'll hear more about each of those different drugs later from Mary Curry. But if we go to the next slide, I want to talk about the process of getting there. So how do we get to that clinical trial process and even pass that into approval? And so that's a rather lengthy process. As Kenneth noted, we've had a lot of success in SMA, but in general, this is a really lengthy process. About 1 in 1,000 new drugs make it into human testing in a clinical trial. So there's a lot of failure at these early stages. And you can see stage 1 is what we call our pre-discovery stage. So that's basic research, that's clinical observations, that's just learning things about a disease or about the way the human body works in order to inform the second stage, which is drug discovery and preclinical studies. And here's where work is being done to demonstrate that a drug or a target may have some efficacy. And these are usually done with animal studies. If there's good data there and reason to believe that the drug may be efficacious in humans, then things can move into the clinical trial phases. And we'll talk more about each phase of the clinical trials momentarily. After clinical trials, there's FDA review and possible approval, and that moves into stage 5, which is phase 4 clinical trials. And we'll get into all those clinical trial stages here momentarily. Next slide. So a clinical trial is just a type of study where researchers test whether a new drug is safe and effective for people. Clinical trials are conducted in phases that build upon one another. And at the end of each phase, the clinical trial sponsor and the FDA review the results and decide if the new drug will advance to the next phase. Phase 1 involves a small group of healthy volunteers, and the goal here is really to determine if the drug is safe and the dose is correct. If that goal is met, then the trial will move into phase 2, which is a larger group of people, in this case living with SMA. And the goal here is to determine if the drug is safe and provides any benefit to the participants. If that goal is met, then things can move into phase 3, which is an even larger group of SMA affected individuals. And the goal here is to determine further efficacy and safety. And sometimes at this point, there may be what's known as a placebo or sham control group. So part of the participants may be getting the drug and part may be getting a placebo or a sham as a comparator. At the end of phase 3, if the data look good and look like the drug is providing benefit to the participants, the sponsor, generally the drug company who makes the investigational drug, can file a new drug application with FDA. We'll go through that process a little bit here as well momentarily. But then if there is an FDA approval, things can move into phase 4, which is where there's continual data collection here. And the goal with a phase 4 clinical trial is really just to collect more data in an even larger population to ensure things like safety and continued efficacy, and look for potential long-term side effects of the drug in a larger population. Next slide. So Kenneth talked a little bit about the historically narrow inclusion criteria in SMA clinical trials. So we wanted to touch a little bit about how participants in clinical trials are chosen. All clinical trials have eligibility criteria or traits that people who want to enter the study must share. And this clear eligibility criteria makes it easier for researchers to evaluate safety and efficacy. So there's going to be inclusion criteria, or traits that a person must have in order to participate, and there's also going to be exclusion criteria, or traits that prevent a person from participating. And there's a tension between balancing wanting to allow as many people as possible to participate in the trial, but also limiting the number of variables that having a wide range of participants introduces in order to be able to generate data that show efficacy and that show that the drug is working. And so generally having a narrow set of inclusion criteria allows for better demonstration of efficacy, because there's some elimination of various variables within the patient population. Next slide. And so going back to that FDA regulatory process, I mentioned at the end of phase 3, a sponsor, usually the drug company, may submit a new drug application to be reviewed by FDA. And this new drug application simply asks the FDA to look at the data and to approve the drug. And so the company is going to submit all their animal data and the human data from the trial and their analysis of that data. The FDA takes that application and it has 60 days to decide whether to file that NDA to be fully reviewed. If they file that NDA, it will be assigned a review team to evaluate the sponsor's data. And so that review team is assigned, and then a PDUFA date is set. And so once filed, the review process has to be completed within 10 months. The date at the end of that review period is known as a PDUFA date. And so that's the date when FDA is expected to have a decision. And sometimes the FDA review process can be expedited, and these are things called accelerated approval, fast track, breakthrough therapy, or priority review. These are generally reserved for instances where there is not another drug to meet the need that is existing. And so a lot of those early therapies, the first drugs that were approved from SMA, did receive these different forms of expedited review. And then the FDA is also responsible for the important process of drug labeling. So that's deciding what goes on the drug's label, or sort of the prescribing information, who can take the drug and under what circumstances. And this is based on data that is submitted by the sponsor as well with the NDA package. And this generally can be broader than sometimes the clinical trial data, as we've seen previously, but also can be limited to the clinical trial data based on the FDA's discretion on whether the risk-benefit profile is there or not. Next slide. And so after FDA approval, there are often what are known as phase 4 trials, or post-marketing surveillance. And so once FDA approves the drug, a post-marketing surveillance stage begins, and the sponsor is required to submit periodic safety updates to FDA. This is known as phase 4 of the clinical trial, so that's after drug approval. Not all phase 4 studies are post-marketing surveillance studies, but every post-marketing surveillance study is a phase 4 study. And so the main objectives of these studies are to look at the drug in the real world setting. As we talked about before, the clinical trials often have narrow inclusion criteria, so there's going to be more people and with more variables participating in this, so to get an idea of what the drug is doing in the real world setting, and to evaluate longer term risk in a larger population, and to collect additional safety data. Next slide. And so with that recap of the clinical trial phases, I will end the regulatory process. I'll turn it over to Mary Curry, who's going to give us some exciting new updates on recruiting and recently fully enrolled trials.
Thank you, Jackie. So as Kenneth and Jackie have noted, the SMA drug pipeline has culminated in a number of active trials. In addition to the programs developed to optimize current treatments by exploring impact of higher doses and different delivery methods, we have studies evaluating impact of switching from one approved treatment to another, or as well as the use of an approved treatment in combination with a muscle-enhancing treatment. We're also seeing an expansion in the number of studies for adults. Biogen, for instance, is currently recruiting participants within ASCEND to evaluate the safety and efficacy of higher dose nusinersen in participants between 15 and 50 years of age that were previously treated with risdiplam. Biogen also completed enrollment for 2 trials, the DEVOTE study, which is evaluating higher dose nusinersen in children and adults, and RESPOND, that is evaluating safety and outcomes following treatment with nusinersen in infants previously treated with gene therapy. Additionally, Alcyon Therapeutics is working in collaboration with Biogen to assess the safety and performance of an implantable device for the infusion of Spinraza. Individuals 3 years of age or older that are candidates for Spinraza treatment may be eligible to participate. Next slide, please. Novartis Gene Therapies is actively recruiting participants within 2 clinical trials at this time. Spectrum, a long-term follow-up study for patients treated with gene therapy via a prior trial, and also Strength, an open-label study that is evaluating the safety, tolerability, and efficacy of intrathecal gene therapy in individuals living with SMA who have discontinued treatment with nusinersen or risdiplam. Individuals that are 2 to 18 years of age may be eligible to participate within Strength. A third trial, STEER, is evaluating the efficacy and safety of intrathecal gene therapy in pediatric patients that are living with SMA type 2. This study is almost fully enrolled, and we anticipate updates regarding the change in status in the near future. Next slide, please. Genentech is also sponsoring 2 actively recruiting trials. The first study, known as Manatee, is evaluating the safety and efficacy of an investigational muscle-enhancing therapy known as R07-204239 in combination with risdiplam. Ambulatory individuals that are 2 to 25 years of age may be eligible. A long-term follow-up study of risdiplam, known as WE SMA, is currently recruiting individuals of all ages that are receiving treatment at this time, specifically with risdiplam. We also wanted to highlight 2 studies for which recruitment is pending. The Himalaya trials will seek to evaluate the effectiveness and safety of risdiplam in infants that have previously received gene therapy. An announcement will be shared with the community when both studies initiate enrollment. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to Manatee, there are several trials that are exploring the use of a muscle-enhancing therapy in combination with an approved disease-modifying treatment. Scholar Rock, for instance, recently completed enrollment for Sapphire, a phase 3 study that is evaluating the efficacy and safety of apitegromab in patients with later onset SMA that are also receiving nusinersen or risdiplam. Non-ambulatory individuals that are between the ages of 2 and 21 were enrolled within this trial. Next slide, please. In addition, Biohaven also finalized recruitment for Resilient, a study evaluating the efficacy and safety of a muscle-enhancing therapy known as teldefgrobep alpha in combination with an approved disease-modifying treatment. Both ambulatory and non-ambulatory individuals between 4 and 21 years of age were eligible to participate within this trial. Next slide, please. And lastly, NMD Pharma is initiating recruitment within Synapse SMA, a phase 2 study that is evaluating the safety and efficacy of a muscle-enhancing treatment known as NMD 670 in ambulatory adults living with SMA type 3. Participants with 3 to 5 copies of SMN2 that are between the ages of 18 and 60 years may be eligible to enroll within this trial. Next slide, please. Now, if proven to be of benefit, the data from these trials may not only lead to new approvals and label expansions, but also provide additional evidence to guide the decision-making within our community as it relates to treatment. So if you or a family member has an interest or simply would like to learn more, we encourage you to visit the Cure SMA website. Our clinical trials page that's shown here on screen provides information on all of the actively recruiting SMA studies. Detailed study descriptions are available via the 2 accordion menus at the top of the page, and we encourage you to review and share this content with members of your care team to discuss eligibility. Next slide. We also wanted to highlight some additional resources that may be used to enhance your decision-making as it relates to participation. Cure SMA has developed 2 care series booklets. The first, Learning About Clinical Trials, describes what a clinical trial is, how participants are chosen, and what it is like to participate. The second resource, Scientific Considerations for Drug Combinations, provides an overview of combination therapy and the therapeutic strategies that are actively being explored. Both resources are available on the Care Series Booklets page on Cure SMA's website. You may also request print copies by completing a brief survey that is located on the page. We also wanted to highlight a few resources that are made available by the FDA that share some guidance on trial eligibility and the drug approval process. And direct links will be provided within the chat feature and also will be shared subsequent to this webcast. Next slide. Additionally, to further enhance community awareness, the Cure SMA industry collaboration is working to develop a new campaign. Our goal with this initiative is really to empower adults and caregivers in your decision-making as it relates to clinical trials, and also to enhance our community's awareness and access to those actively recruiting studies and specific sites. The campaign itself will feature a series of interactive on-demand resources that will include a clinical trials finder and handouts. Next slide. The clinical trials finder widget will be powered and run by an automated program that will pull information directly from clinicaltrials.gov to the Cure SMA website once launched. And this will ensure that the most up-to-date information is readily accessible to our community. Search results may be segmented by keyword, location, and participant age, but we are also working to incorporate some SMA-specific search filters such as functional status and treatment status. And our goal is really to help community members narrow those search results based upon eligibility. Next slide. Now for the handouts, we are working to develop materials that will offer a plain language summary of the informed consent process. This process itself is really key because it provides opportunities for trial participants and those interested to have a full understanding of the benefits and risks and overall study design. During the informed consent process, potential trial participants will receive a copy of the informed consent document from the research team. And this document outlines each of those items. So the handout that we're looking to generate will provide an overview of key components and terms that may be located within the consent. Next slide. We are also working to develop a screening visit checklist to enhance preparation for this visit. The handout itself will feature a series of questions that community members can ask research staff to enhance understanding regarding the trial itself. And it will also include space for the documentation of key visit information, so all of this info can be centrally located for individuals and families. Next slide. And lastly, we are working to develop a travel itinerary to support travel planning. We fully understand and appreciate that travel can be a source of stress and burden. And so as a means of support, this handout will include tips on how to manage appointments and prepare for any travel requirements to the study site. All of these materials will be launched on the Cure SMA website early next year. Next slide. Thank you again for joining us during today's presentation. And Amy, I will turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you to Kenneth and Jackie as well. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance of today's presentation. We are going to go through as many of those as time allows. And then at the end, after we do our Q&A, I'll share some next steps again about the recording of the webinar and some other clinical trials related activities we will be communicating to all of you about. But let's get started by jumping into the questions. The first question for the group is asking for or about any evidence for dual therapies.
Sure, thanks, Amy. I think there's great evidence for dual therapies, and we're starting to see in some of the clinical trials that Mary Curry just highlighted, testing a new investigational drug on top or with an SMN enhancing drug in the background. And then there's a lot of biological evidence for this too. There's the SMN independent approach and the SMN independent approach combined with the SMN dependent approach, targeting different things within the body. And there's a lot of potential for that to work in synergy. So I think we are starting to see a lot more of these dual or combination therapies come into play in these clinical trials. Will give us a better indicator of the efficacy of that.
Thank you, Jackie. The next question asks, are there any trials for non-ambulatory adults?
So yes, there are several trials for non-ambulatory adults at this time. Those that are actively recruiting include Ascend for higher dose nusinersen, the Pierre device trial, and the long-term follow-up study known as We SMA. The Sapphire and Resilient trials that recently completed enrollment also included non-ambulatory adults within that study.
Thank you. Next question is, some people take Spinraza and Evrysdi together as dual therapy. Will there be any publications or clinical trials about this?
So although to date trials have not explored use of these treatments in combination as a dual therapy approach, there are trials that are evaluating the efficacy of switching from one approved disease modifying treatment to another. However, internally, we are working to also collect some real world data to examine use of these treatments in combination.
Great, thank you. Next, this is more of a statement than a bit of a statement and a bit of a question. Please include any comments on adult patients to clinical trials. So anything you have to add about adults receiving clinical trials.
Yeah, we're seeing more and more inclusion of adults in clinical trials. For example, Ascend, which is looking at higher dose nusinersen in patients previously treated with risdiplam, is recruiting adults up to 50 years of age. Devote is recruiting anyone 7 days of age and older. And then NMD Pharma's new trial called Synapse goes up to 60 years of age. And so we're seeing others go into young adulthood as well. So I think there is more and more inclusion of adults in these upcoming trials than we have seen previously.
Great, thank you. Next is, will a treatment method be found to treat or reverse SMA disease in adults in the future? Can gene therapy be applied to adults, and will the disease be reversible after gene therapy in adults?
So I think this area really is our main focus right now, where we're looking at how do we develop additional treatments, additional care approaches that can work on top of what we've already got to help reverse symptoms. And so this is a lot of the trials that we have going on. We're really looking at this as most people in the community, and it's probably about 95% of the community are people that were diagnosed with symptoms, older and adults. So how do we now reverse? And this is what we're looking at, that you've got to do the genetics first. We've got to sort that out to hopefully kind of stop the disease in its place, maybe just slow it down. But then you're going to need additional treatments and focused on these other areas of the body, especially the muscles and the nerves, to look at that approach of bringing back lost function. So that's what we're focused on. We do have quite a lot of trials going on, and several of these trials that have reached full enrollment that are going to hopefully give us answers next year focused on that. In regard to kind of the gene therapy angle on this, so gene therapy for adults, that's what we're looking at with that different delivery approach. The IT trial, the intrathecal delivery of gene therapy, is what we're looking at for potential gene therapy for adults. That's what you need, where the intravenous approach that is approved now only really works for small individuals, really kind of infants, very small. You need the intrathecal delivery to make it practical for older adults. We don't know yet the results, but that's in that final pivotal stage, full enrollment as well, the intrathecal gene therapy. In terms of gene therapy, then reversing for adults, it really is going to be that same combination as well. So gene therapy, can it be available for adults to stop the disease, the progression? But with everything that we're saying, it's going to take a combination here, additional care, additional treatments on top to help reverse.
Thank you. So we've got two more questions. The first being, is there any additional information that can be provided regarding how each treatment is being tested for pregnancy-related impacts, so patients can understand those risks or better understand those risks? So looking for any information on that.
So we don't have the answers or the data yet, but actually we do know that there's some studies that are being planned that are just getting ready to launch right now. And I think 2 studies really for the approved treatments for adults, Spinraza and Evrysdi, looking at collecting that information on safety around pregnancy. And so those studies are getting ready, should be getting kind of launched pretty soon. It will take a while to get the data in, get the volume of evidence that we need, but those should be starting up pretty soon. One of the things just to highlight here as well is we are looking here to do a series of webinars on clinical trials, and one of the follow-on ones, which I think will be done by Genentech, might give a little bit more detail on their planned pregnancy study. So more information to come on those soon.
Thank you. And our final question for today is seeking information for trials for older adults, type 3, 40-year-old ambulatory.
Yeah, so in addition to some of those that we touched on earlier, I think particularly for this individual's circumstances that they described, their age, their type, their ambulatory status, NMD Pharma's trial may be a potential fit for this person, and that's looking at a first-in-class small molecule inhibitor of a chloride channel, which is targeted to improve muscle function, and so that might be something that individual would want to look into.
All right, thank you. And thank you again, Kenneth, Jackie, and Mary. And thank you to all of you who joined us today for the webinar. Next week, early next week, you'll be receiving an email from us, which will include a link to the recording of the webinar for folks who registered and couldn't make it, or if you couldn't make it to the entire webinar, or if you would just like to revisit some of what we've talked about today. We will also included in that message will be some just some of the latest clinical trial updates, much of which we touched on today, as well as a save the date for our next webinar in this clinical trial series. As Kenneth mentioned, this will be part of a series. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, December 14th at the same time at noon Central. and we hope you'll be able to join us for that webinar as well. You'll also be able to find next week the recording of this presentation, the video on curesma.org on the clinical trials page, and also on our YouTube page. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out, and stay tuned for the recordings next week and the save the date. And thank you so much for joining us today.